You are still asking people for permission to exist. Not out loud, you would never say it like that. But it is there, in the way you pause before speaking in a room full of people, in the way you check your phone after posting something, waiting, in the way you rehearse what you are going to say before you say it, not to be clear, but to be safe, to make sure nobody takes it the wrong way, to make sure they still think well of you. That pause, that edit, that small, almost invisible shrinking, that is the thing we need to talk about today. Because here is what most people never say out loud. The need for approval does not feel like weakness when you are inside it. It feels like being reasonable, being considerate, being careful. The man who constantly adjusts himself for every room he enters does not think of himself as desperate for validation. He thinks of himself as socially intelligent, adaptable, easy to be around. But there is something underneath that adaptation, something that, if you sit with it long enough, starts to feel a lot like a cage. You have felt it. That strange exhaustion after a conversation where you said all the right things and left feeling somehow less than when you arrived. Like you spent the whole interaction managing someone else's impression of you and forgot to actually be there yourself. What kind of man have you become while you were busy waiting to be told you are enough? The architecture nobody taught you to question. Here is the honest truth about where this comes from. The need for approval is not a character flaw. It is not proof that you are weak or undisciplined or broken. It is a mechanism, one that was built into you before you had any say in the matter. When you were young, approval meant safety, the nod from a parent, the acceptance of a group, the grade that told you that you were doing it right. Your brain, which is a survival machine first and a philosophical instrument second, learned a very simple equation. External validation equals belonging and belonging equals safety. That is not a mistake. That is biology. The problem is that the equation never got updated. The threat is gone. You are not a child anymore, dependent on the approval of the adults in the room to survive. But the software is still running, quietly, in the background, shaping decisions you think you are making freely. You do not apply for the thing because you are afraid of how it will look if you fail. You do not say the thing you actually think because the room might disagree. You do not leave the situation that is costing you your self-respect because you are waiting for someone to give you permission. Nobody did that to you. That is the part that stings. There was a man who understood this better than almost anyone, not a therapist, not a self-help writer. An emperor, Marcus Aurelius, ruled Rome at its height. He was surrounded at all times by people whose entire purpose was to tell him what he wanted to hear. Flatterers, politicians, men who smiled and meant nothing by it. He led armies through plague and betrayal. He governed the most powerful empire in the known world, and every morning, before the day claimed him, he sat alone and wrote to himself, not for publication, not for posterity. Nobody was supposed to read what he wrote. It was a man, in private, building something inside himself that the world could not touch. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And when I read that for the first time, I did not find it comforting in the way most people find things comforting. I found it unsettling, because it meant there was no external condition to wait for, no moment when the world would finally arrange itself in a way that made it okay to start living without apology. The strength he was pointing at was always internal, and the work of finding it was always going to be mine. It is always going to be yours. The man who performs and the man who builds there are two kinds of men, and you have met both of them because they both live inside you. The first man lives for the reaction. He thinks carefully about what he posts, not because he values precision, but because he is monitoring the response. He softens his real opinions in meetings until they are so hedged they barely count as opinions. He is funny in the way the room wants him to be funny, serious in the way the room wants him to be serious. He is extremely good at reading what is needed from him and delivering it. He is also exhausted, constantly. In a way he cannot fully explain, the second man has stopped performing, not because he stopped caring about the world, but because he started building something. A set of values that do not shift depending on who is in the room, a standard for himself that exists whether anyone is watching or not, a sense of his own weight, not arrogance, just solidity. The feeling of a man who knows where he stands. You have seen this second man, maybe from a distance. Maybe you saw him in a meeting, say something direct and then wait, genuinely unconcerned with how it landed. Maybe you saw him walk away from something that looked impressive without explaining himself and felt something you couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, something closer to recognition. The man who performs is always half present. Part of him is always watching the audience. The man who builds is entirely in the room. And here is what nobody tells you. The second man is not comfortable to be around, not because he is aggressive or cold, but because his presence is a quiet reminder to everyone else in the room that there is another way to move through the world. And most people are not ready to see that the man who needs nothing from the room owns the room. The lever you keep handing over this is the mechanism. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. When you need someone's approval, truly need it, in the way that shapes your behavior, you hand them a lever, a direct line into your decision-making. And the extraordinary thing is they do not even need to pull it. You pull it for them. You adjust, shrink, soften, reroute, all in anticipation of a judgment they may never actually deliver. Schopenhauer observed something that still holds true today. Most human suffering comes not from what actually happens to us, but from the imagined judgment of people who are, at that very moment, too preoccupied with their own reputation to truly see ours. Think about that. You are running a constant background simulation of what other people think of you. And those other people are running their own simulation about what other people think of them. Almost nobody is actually watching you with the sustained, critical attention you imagine. The jury you keep performing for is largely fictional, but the cost of performing for it is entirely real. The man who doesn't speak his mind in the meeting, not because he has nothing to say, but because he is afraid of how it will look if the idea fails, has been controlled. Without coercion, without threat, he handed himself over and walked away thinking he made a free choice. That is the specific loneliness of approval-seeking that nobody talks about. It does not feel like control from the outside. It feels like caution from the inside. When you stop needing their approval, you stop being their instrument. Stop for a moment. I want you to actually sit with what was just said, not skim it. Not nod along to the idea of it while already moving toward the next thing, because I know there is a part of you reading this and thinking, yes, but my situation is different. My circumstances require me to be careful. The people in my life, the job, the social dynamics. I cannot just stop caring what people think. I am not telling you to stop caring what people think. I am telling you that there is a difference between considering the perspective of people you respect and needing the approval of everyone in the room to feel okay about your own existence. You already know the difference. That is why you are still here. Let's continue. The silence they mistake for weakness, the approval-seeking man overshares. This is not an accident. Over-explanation is a defense mechanism. If you explain yourself thoroughly enough, if you lay out every reason, every consideration, every nuance, then surely nobody can judge you. You have preempted the judgment by making the case for yourself in advance. But notice what that costs. Every time you explain yourself when no explanation was asked for, you are broadcasting that you are worried about how you are perceived. You are giving away information. You are showing the room a version of yourself that needs to be understood before it can be comfortable. The man who has broken free does not explain. He acts, he decides, he speaks. And then he is done. This is not rudeness. It is not coldness. It is something closer to trust, a trust in himself that does not require external ratification to feel stable. You change your habits. You start waking earlier, eating differently, spending your time in ways that feel strange to the people around you. They ask why. And the old version of you would have given them a paragraph, a justification, a defense of the life you are choosing because somewhere inside you still needed their approval of it. The new version says, "It works for me," and then moves on, not aggressively, not dramatically, just completely. There is a particular kind of authority in a man who does not feel the need to defend his choices. It is not the authority of dominance. It is the authority of someone who has already settled the question for himself and simply does not need to reopen it for the benefit of the room. You do not owe anyone an explanation for becoming yourself, why your becoming makes people uncomfortable. Nietzsche understood something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. He was not a comfortable man to read. He was not trying to be. But there is one idea in his work that cuts through everything, and it is this: the crowd does not want you to become who you are. Not because the crowd is evil, but because your becoming, your actual, genuine becoming, is a quiet disruption to everyone around you who has not done the same work. When you stop seeking approval, something changes in the energy of the rooms you walk into. You do not announce it. You do not perform it. You simply stop being available to be managed by the usual levers: flattery, guilt, social pressure, the fear of disapproval, and people feel that. They cannot always name it, but they feel it. The most threatening thing you can do to a crowd is stop needing it. This is not about superiority. That is the misreading. It is not that you have risen above other people. It is that you have stopped participating in a game that most people are playing so automatically they do not even know it is a game. And that, your quiet, undramatic exit from the game, reads to some people as arrogance. It reads as indifference. Sometimes it reads as something they cannot quite name but instinctively distrust. That discomfort in others is not your problem to solve. Nietzsche called this self-overcoming. The will to power directed not outward, not at other people, not at the world, but inward, at the version of yourself that still needs permission, that still flinches when the room goes quiet after something you said, that still edits itself before it speaks. Becoming who you actually are is the most difficult and most necessary project a man can undertake, and it requires, at some point, disappointing almost everyone who was comfortable with the previous version of you. The most threatening thing you can do to a crowd is stop needing it. The inner fortress, Marcus Aurelius called it the inner citadel, not a metaphor he used lightly. He was describing something he had actually built, a place inside himself that external events could batter but not breach. And he was emperor. He had more external events to batter him than most of us will ever encounter. Betrayal, military failure, the deaths of children, the slow collapse of institutions he had given his life to maintain. And still he wrote, in those private journals nobody was meant to read, "I have what I need. It is here. It does not depend on any of this. The inner fortress is not a wall against people." That is the misunderstanding. It is not about cutting people off or becoming unreachable or retreating into some cold private world. It is a foundation, something built so deeply into who you are that the surface weather, praise, criticism, approval, rejection, cannot get all the way down to it. When your sense of your own worth is no longer rented from other people's reactions, something genuinely shifts. Criticism doesn't wound the same way. You can hear it, hold it up to the light, take what is true, and set aside what isn't. You do not need to collapse under it to prove that you're taking it seriously. Praise doesn't inflate you the same way. You can receive it without suddenly raising your estimate of yourself based on who said it. Your self-assessment has a more stable source. You become harder to move. And being hard to move, not in a rigid, closed-off sense, but in the sense of a man with a settled center of gravity, is the beginning of something real. The man who used to spend 3 days inside his own head after one critical comment, that man is not gone. He is just no longer running things. In his place is someone who heard the comment, considered it, and moved on. Not because he stopped caring about quality, because he stopped outsourcing his self-assessment to whoever spoke last. An unshakable man is not cold. He is just finished being moved by things that were never worth moving for. What dangerous actually means. Here is what this word means, and what it does not. Dangerous does not mean violent. It does not mean ruthless. It does not mean the man who steps on people on his way somewhere, or the man who mistakes cruelty for strength, or the man who has confused indifference with power. That man is not dangerous. That man is just broken in a way that looks like confidence from a distance. The dangerous man, in the sense that matters, is simply unmanageable by the usual levers. He cannot be flattered into compliance. Praise does not make him agreeable to things he knows are wrong. He cannot be guilt-tripped into shrinking. Social pressure does not make him betray what he has decided to stand for. He cannot be kept in line by the threat of disapproval, because he has already reckoned with disapproval and found that it does not kill you. That is what makes him dangerous to anyone who was planning to use those levers on him. And there are always people planning to use them. He is suddenly unavailable. The usual mechanisms do not work, and to himself, that same quality is just called freedom. You have seen what this looks like in real life, even if you didn't have the words for it at the time. The man who turns down the opportunity that looks impressive but feels wrong, without spending 40 minutes explaining himself to the room. The man who ends the friendship that had been costing him his self-respect, without waiting for permission, without making it a drama. The man who says the unpopular thing in the meeting, clearly, without hedging it into something unrecognizable, and then lets it sit there, not aggressive, not performing toughness, just free. And this is the strange thing about that kind of freedom. It is invisible until you have it. When you are inside the approval-seeking loop, the man who has exited it looks arrogant, looks cold, looks like he doesn't care about anyone. But that is just the view from inside the loop. From the outside, it looks like something else entirely. It looks like a man who has finally come home to himself. Real freedom is not something you announce. It is something people notice you no longer need to. The path that was always yours. I want to be honest with you about something. This is not easy. None of this is easy. And anybody who tells you that the path from approval-seeking to genuine inner freedom is a matter of mindset shifts and morning routines is selling you something. It costs. It costs specifically the thing you have been relying on. When you stop performing for the crowd, and I mean actually stop, not just stop in theory, while still checking for the reaction, there is a period where you feel unmoored. The feedback loop that was telling you whether you were doing okay goes quiet, and in that quiet, before the inner compass calibrates fully, there is something that can feel a lot like loneliness. You have probably already felt some version of this. The strange experience of being more yourself and simultaneously more alone, of speaking more honestly and being understood less, of making choices that are genuinely yours and finding that the people around you have less to say about it, because there is less room for them in it. That is not failure. That is what the early stages of actually becoming yourself feel like. You are someone who chose to see clearly when seeing clearly cost you something. That is not a small thing. Most people spend an entire lifetime choosing comfortable fog over uncomfortable clarity. You chose clarity, probably more than once, probably at a cost you haven't fully talked about with anyone, and here is what nobody says to you. The fact that this has been hard is the evidence that you are doing the real version of it. The easy version, the version where you read about stoicism, feel inspired for a week, then go back to seeking approval with slightly more self-awareness. That is available to anyone. You are not doing that version. I know because you are still reading. The work Marcus Aurelius described in those private journals, the daily, unglamorous, unwitnessed work of building an interior life that does not depend on exterior conditions. That work is what you are doing, not perfectly, not without regression, but doing it. The day you stop needing their approval is not the day you become arrogant, it is the day you become free. And a free man, in a world full of people performing for each other, is quietly the most dangerous thing in the room. Before you go, if this landed somewhere specific, if there was a line in here that hit a place you don't usually let things hit, drop one word in the comments. Building, no explanation needed. No context required. I'll know exactly what you mean. And so will everyone else who is here for the right reasons. If you want to keep thinking like this, the subscribe button is there, not as a favor to this channel, because you started something today, reading this, and it would be a shame to let the momentum die here. Next, we talk about the specific moment most people give their power away without ever realizing it happened. Not in a dramatic confrontation, not in a moment of obvious weakness in a quiet room, in an ordinary moment in a way that looks, from the outside, almost like kindness.